For our site organization, I think before we talk about a URL, it's important to talk about how a site is organized. And essentially you have your domain at the top level, a category URL, a subcategory URL, files, document, and it's nice to think of this kind of with a file cabinet analogy. I really like this analogy of the top level domain being .com, .net, .org. This is the file cabinet, and each drawer is a category, and each folder is a subcategory, and the files, the .pngs, the JPEGs, the images, the JavaScripts, those are the files, and then the actual document would be the .html or .php, and then the label for that document is the title tag. This analogy of the file cabinet really holds up and helps to understand the URL best practices and the 7 different parts of a URL. So these 7 different parts of a URL are the protocol, which is the HTTP, the subdomain, which could be www or just nothing. You're not required to have a subdomain. You just need that consistency in your URL if you do use a subdomain. Make sure you're always using www if you choose that route. The domain, which is the actual name, in our case Miami Fishing, the top level domain, which is, as I mentioned, .com, .net, .org, the folder or the path, in this case it's what we catch. The page is Atlantic Sailfish, and we can have a named anchor, what's called a named anchor, to push us to different areas to the page if we want to scroll down that page, and that's just the # and the name, and that's called the named anchor. So let's talk about some of the best practices now that we understand the different URL parts. The first is obviously to have a keyword in the URL, and one of the reasons this is important is because it helps in click-through rate on the search engine results. You can see if we do a search for men's clothing that we have bold letters. Overstock has put this at the beginning of their title tag rather than their name and description of the page. They have Overstock second and men's clothing first. You can see also that Google bolds the words that we did the search for. So this helps with our click-through rate. Extensionless URLs, as I mentioned, gives flexibility for future changes. We can always keep that Atlantic Sailfish page at the same location. Even if we change platforms, we can change and keep that URL the same without having to do 301 redirects and URL changes. So we have a nice, consistent URL that will always be there for the remainder of time, hopefully, if we have it extensionless. Another reason this is important is because the content can change, but the URL stays the same. That URL will always be there. We can change the individual content. We could put specials on that page if it was a travel page. Whatever it is, you can put new content on it, but the URL stays the same. Named anchor links. These don't cause duplicate content issues. These are fine to have. You can see with our page here, we have the charter info page, and each of these links on the drop-down navigation is actually just an anchored link on the same page. So this is just one long scrolling page that describes all of these different types of charters. No duplicate content issues here. If you were creating multiple pages with the same content, that would create a duplicate content problem. Some bad ideas when it comes to URLs is tracking parameters. I know it's important to track and pull things into analytics, but you need to at least be using rel canonical and try not to get those tracking URLs indexed. So rel canonical will help with this. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the series. Having a flat architecture with no category or subcategory is really going to cause your site a problem in the long run if you scale that site to lots of pages, nondescript character strings, or session IDs. We have some examples of those here in the next slide with slashes as well. If you have those slashes and they're not canonicalized, then you're going to have potentially problems with duplicate content. It should be directed to one single version, and it should have appropriate category subcategory structure. A good rule of thumb is below 4 categories, subcategories, but again, depending on the size of the site, you may or may not need that level. If you only have 100 pages, you're probably only going to need 2 levels. If you have 1,000 pages, you might need 3. If you have tens of thousands of pages, you might need 4 or 5. But keep this in mind that you do have to redirect those slashes and make sure there's not duplicate content and that you're using rel canonical where necessary. It's best to use static URLs. These long dynamic URLs will get indexed at this point, but they're not nice to have, and they can create duplicate URLs and just create what I'd call index bloat. You have a lot of pages in the search engine index that aren't necessarily valuable. You're just kind of bloating that index size. Try to stay away from the dynamic URLs wherever possible. So the overall best practices for URLs, these are good rule of thumb. Most of these are pretty standard best practices. Keyword in the URL for category subcategory, but not going more than a few levels deep. Keyword in the URL if you can get it. 2 to 3 dashes between words. So if you have city names like San Francisco in this case, a dash in between those. You might go San Francisco dash charters or something, but you don't want to go probably beyond 5 words to describe a page. Try to use dashes and not underscores. They're treated very similar, but underscores can be confusing for a variety of different ways. Up to 3 words to describe that category or directory, that subcategory, and make sure that if you're doing tracking and you have those long dynamic URLs, you're using rel canonical so that you don't end up with duplicate URLs.